Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining your hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Your hour with APA Virginia is hosted on the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. I'm going to give everyone a minute to log in and get settled before we kick everything off this afternoon. All right. Thank you again for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, we want to remind you of a few exciting things APA Virginia has coming up and a couple of housekeeping items. APA Virginia needs you. As we're gearing up for the 2021 conference, we're looking for volunteers to help us pull it all together. So if you're interested, please email us at admin, that's ADMIN, at apavirginia.com. Additionally, more information will be released soon regarding the call for session proposals and our format for this year. So be on the lookout for that. Join us next month for the February webinar on Monday, the 22nd, brought to us, by the brick industry. We'll focus on the impact of masonry ordinances in promoting sustainable communities. So as we do every month, this webinar, How Historic Tax Credits Shape Communities, will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page by the end of the day. We encourage you to visit our YouTube and see past webinars or share it with colleagues. As a reminder, we will hold questions until the end, but as the webinar is going on, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box on your dashboard, and we will answer them at the end in the order in which they came in. Again, thank you to the Berkeley Group for making this webinar series possible. We're always looking for new webinars, presenters, or topics. So if you have one you would like us to look into, please email us again at admin, that's ADMIN, at apavirginia.com. This month's webinar, How Historic Tax Credits Shape Communities, is presented by Richard Sidebottom. Richard has over 15 years of expertise with the federal and state historic tax credit programs. In the Southeast, Richard provides consulting services for federal and state historic tax credit certification, the National Register of Historic Places, special state historic preservation tax incentives, and related regulatory programs. He works with clients to identify creative solutions that address project needs and meet regulatory requirements for the historic tax credit programs. Prior to joining the MHA in 2010, Richard ran a private historic preservation practice in South Carolina. He is also a former reviewer and supervisor of compliance, tax incentive, and outreach programs with the South Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. Richard holds a BA in History and Classical Studies from Emory University and a Master of Architectural History and Preservation degree from the University of Virginia. At this time, I'll go ahead and mute myself and hand it over to our presenter.
Great. Thank you, Paige. Very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And I look forward to presenting a little bit of information to you all about the historic tax credit programs, and in particular, how they've been great tools for planners and changing communities throughout the Commonwealth and throughout the country. As Paige said, our firm, MacRostie Historic Advisors, provides consulting expertise to developers and owners of historic buildings around the country. And we currently have 7 offices around the country. I run the Southeastern office out of Charleston, South Carolina. So even though I'm not there in Virginia with you all today, I am happy to be here with you. Let me just change my screen that I'm sharing. Hang on. Make sure that we get the full screen view. All right. Our firm works on historic projects around the country. My office, the Southeast, runs really from Maryland out to Mississippi and all areas in between. So we've worked on projects throughout that area, throughout the country, and look forward to talking today to you about the programs. Just to give you an idea, I've got a little bit of information here on the basics of the historic tax credit programs, but I always find these webinars, talks much more interesting with actual examples of projects. So that's what we're going to take a look at for the most part, is some examples from around the country and around the Southeast in particular. But I do want to go through the basics of the program. The Federal Historic Tax Credit Program has been around in the current form that we have since really the mid-1980s, and it's been one of the more successful community revitalization tools, really in a planner's or in a developer's package of things to use and toolbox. It is a 20% credit on what a owner of a building spends in rehabilitation of the historic building. In order to qualify, it does need to be a significant rehabilitation. So that owner needs to be reinvesting what they have in adjusted basis back in the rehab of the building. So for a recent sale of a building, you'll need to be spending essentially the sale price of the building. For properties that have been held for a longer period of time, that number will come down, but in general, it needs to be a substantial rehabilitation. And that's how the federal government defines it, 100% the adjusted basis. It also has to be a certified historic structure. This means the National Register of Historic Places for our program. That is the honorary list that the national government uses to designate historic buildings. There are tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of buildings in this country on the register right now, either because of their position in a historic district, a National Register historic district, or because they're individually designated as historic. And then the third piece of our program for qualifying for the historic credits is a design review process with the State Historic Preservation Office and with the National Park Service. These programs, the Historic Tax Credit Program at the national level, is administered by the Internal Revenue Service, as you would expect, and the design elements regulated by the National Park Service Office for Technical Preservation Services. I mentioned the National Register. Typically, to be considered for the National Register, a building needs to be at least 50 years old. And that building also needs to be either architecturally or historically significant in some way. And as I mentioned, National Register districts are the way that we capture most of the historic buildings in our country on the National Register. Just a first example, pretty straightforward example, Brooklyn Park Apartments, are also referred to as Highland Park Apartments in Richmond. This was a historic school. The historic Highland Park School was converted into apartments in the late 20th century. This was rehabbed recently by CPDC, our client. No question, this is a historic building, a school. Those typically are important community resources from a historic perspective. They were spending a substantial amount of money in rehabilitating the building to keep it as apartments. You can see that the staircase, the main central staircase in the building, was retained as part of this, as were most of the exterior features of the building. And it passed through that design review process with the Department of Historic Resources in Richmond and then the National Park Service as well. Cost about $12 million total, or $11.5 million total, $9 million in what we call QREs, or qualified rehab expenses, and then a 20% federal tax credit calculated on that qualified rehab expense cost, and the Virginia state tax credit, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a second, 25% calculated on that same $9.3 million number. This kept what were at the time vacant apartments, they'd been vacant for a couple of years in this historic school, kept them as 77 senior apartments, as you can see there. So that's a pretty straightforward example. Building that's clearly a historic building. I think from most people's perspective, you can see that. And a substantial amount of money was being used for rehabilitating it. And it managed to get through that design review process that I mentioned. So that's the first example, straightforward. I do want to just take a minute. We have a couple of poll questions. It would help us, I think, in understanding the makeup of your group and how familiar you are with the historic credit. You can see on your screen there 3 questions. So if you guys could lock in your answers on those. How familiar are you with the historic tax credit program? What sector do you work in? And what type of geography do you work in, either in Virginia or if you work nationally, regionally? So just if you could pick the best answer there. Give you a couple more seconds to lock those in. So it looks like most of us have heard of the tax credit programs. The majority of outside of that are folks that have worked with it slightly. Just 5% or so have worked often with them, you'd say. Most of y'all are with local government in some sort of planning capacity. And it looks like a pretty good spread of where you all work. So that's very helpful. I'm going to turn that off. That's great. And thank you, Paige, for getting that poll up there on the screen. Just to carry on, the programs that we have at the federal level and the state level, in fact, at this point, 35 states around the country have some sort of state historic tax credit program that goes along with the federal program. Most of them follow a pretty similar process. And without a doubt, the most difficult piece of getting these programs or getting these projects to a point where they can be approved or where they're completed successfully is getting through that design review process with the state and the National Park Service. Most of you, work with the local government or are familiar with local design review process that a city or your county might have. The National Park Service and the SHPOs, as we call them, the state level, they're reviewing the exterior of the building, as most of your local preservation commissions are, but they're also looking at the interior. They're really going into every part of the building. So there's typically a 3-part approval process, and that follows a 3-part application. The part 1, part 2, and part 3, as some genius named them long ago. They make sense. The part 1 determines whether you have a historic building that you're working with. So it describes when the building was built, why it's historically significant. And for projects that aren't already, or buildings that aren't already listed on the National Register, the part 1 really serves as kind of a preliminary determination for the National Register. If you are within a historic district, then a part 1 needs to be filed to show that you contribute to that historic district. The second part of the application is really where we conduct that design approval process with the State Preservation Office, Department of Historic Resources in Virginia, and the state and the National Park Service. There's a description that's put together, a narrative description. Our firm creates those narratives, works with your architects. Typically, we say that we need about a 50% design development set of drawings to submit that Part 2 application. And that Part 2 gets submitted to the State Preservation Office. They review the materials that are in there, and they pass their recommendation on to the National Park Service, who actually approves the projects. But that process really is contained in the Part 2. The approval of the Part 2 is what will allow a developer, an owner of a historic building, to close their financing, get their construction loan most of the time, and to initiate the building process. The Part 3 is really the simple photo documentation of the project at completion. So when you get your certificate of occupancy, we'll put in the Part 3 to show that you did the work that you said you were going to do in the Part 2. The Park Service and the state each have 30 days to review that application and each piece of that application. So it's a minimum 60-day review period. Typically, it takes a 3 to 4 month, so 3 to 4 month process from the time you first submit your Part 2 till that approval by the Park Service. There's back and forth. We find that quite often the reviewers are slightly above their 30 days. And so we typically tell our clients, prepare for 3 to 4 months in that process. And the review of the Part 2 and the Part 3 is compared to the standards for rehabilitation that were developed by the federal government many years ago. The scope of the design review, as I mentioned, our reviewers look at the outside, but also the interior of the building. Typical kind of hot button issues for them are window replacement, any sort of demolition on the site, new additions to your historic building. On the interior, they're looking at your historic features, your ornamental features in the building, circulation changes, so changing the configuration of walls that you might have in the building. And particularly for larger scale buildings, they're looking for you to retain the corridors. And then typically your changes that you're looking to make or that they'll allow you to make in the design of the building need to be concentrated in secondary areas or outside of those corridors and lobby spaces. We also wind up quite often talking about mechanical systems and details to our reviewers. So this is a pretty intensive design review process, and that's really what people entering the program should know. But it is a valuable historic tax credit. At the state level in Virginia, you all have used, as a state, have used the tax credit program. At the federal level, one of the highest performing states in the country. Your state program's been around since 1997, and it follows pretty closely the federal credit with a 25% income tax credit based on that qualified rehab cost number we looked at earlier. A two-part application, very similar to the Park Service. And importantly, we won't get too far into this today, but only an owner of a historic building can claim a tax credit at the federal level and in Virginia. So larger projects where the developer, the owner, can't use the tax credit themselves, they don't have enough tax liability, they may find an investor that will come into the project, bring money to the project in exchange for the tax credits through syndication. So that is a possibility, but an important piece of this program to know. You can't simply send a tax credit or sell a tax credit to another person. They need to be an owner of the building to claim the credit. So now for some examples. I ran you through the really kind of boring text slides there. I want to take you to a few different projects that speak a little bit more, I think, to your interests in planning and how these programs might be used in different ways for different communities. This is an example from Birmingham, Alabama, that we've worked on. This is the Pizitz department store, built in the 1920s. This was really a staple of retail in Birmingham for 6 decades, 7 decades. It closed this location, which was its headquarters, in 1988. And unfortunately, this building, with its parking garage, occupies an entire city block in downtown Birmingham and was vacant for quite a bit of time. A developer took it over, a local developer took it over around 2000 and had all sorts of plans for what would go in here. It got caught in the housing crisis, the economic downturn in 2008. Finally, in 2017, this was completed. But you can see a couple of before photographs here. This is a large building to have vacancy in the middle of downtown. I'll show you a map in a second that this was a pretty important piece to revitalizing downtown Birmingham, but also stitching it together to a couple of other neighborhoods. This is the interior. When we started, again, department store. So this is the main store, or main floor level with a mezzanine up above it. Vacant for just about 20 years before it got put back into use. This is a map from some of the planners within the Birmingham government. This was really right before rehabilitation started to the Pizitz building. If you're not familiar with Birmingham, the downtown core, the large buildings, banks are in the downtown here. There's a series, really kind of a ring of what were vacant large scale buildings along the south edge of downtown and along the eastern side of downtown as well. Additionally, they have a pretty heavy set of railroad tracks that run right through the middle of the city. South of those railroad tracks is their medical district with the University of Alabama, Birmingham, their arts district, where a lot of the nightlife and restaurants, 5 Points area it's called, developed. So they had a real problem in Birmingham. They had a great historic city, expanded quite a bit during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but a lot of vacancy in these buildings. Birmingham just wasn't as big as the building stock they had. And for that reason, they had these kind of separate islands. People worked downtown, nobody lived there. Everybody went out over here in 5 Points, huge, of course, professional crowd in the medical district, and quite a bit of industrial property along the railroad line here. The Pizitz building, this is oriented the same way downtown here, 5 Points, UAB Medical. Pizitz, as I said, occupied an entire city block right north of the railroad tracks. And so the city knew that this was a pretty important piece of property. The developers, again, invested heavily locally in the area, took on the building to try to do something. They partnered with a client that we've worked with often out of New Orleans, and proposed and eventually built out a mixed-use development here that's made a big difference in Birmingham and fostered a lot of continued development. The main floor with that mezzanine up above was turned into kind of an upscale food court. So you've got a lot of activity there from people that work downtown throughout the day, brought people to the building, brought people to that area of town. The exterior, as you can see, was fixed up. All of the storefronts activated as part of that food hall and retail areas. They have a theater in the basement that a nonprofit arts group uses, and apartments on the upper levels, floors 3 through 7. As I said, this has made a big difference. It's a huge project, $66 million in QREs. That's a $13 million tax project at the federal level and a $5 million cap on the state credit. So This again, it activated kind of a gap, a vacancy in the street pattern downtown, brought people to this area, kind of both providing a place that they can live close to the larger corporate buildings downtown, service for those folks working throughout the day in the food court. But it also brought folks and activated that block, which was a little bit closer to some of those other projects that the city was pushing as well, trying to, again, stitch together the north and the south part of the city across those railroad tracks. That's a huge project. And I know many of you are probably sitting back and saying, well, that's great, but what does a $66 million project have to do with me and my smaller community, smaller city, smaller town? So rest assured, I do have a few examples that I hope at least one of these that we have will strike a chord with you. This is the Gray Hosiery Mill in Hendersonville, North Carolina, a much smaller city. This is, if you're not familiar, Hendersonville is I think about 20 miles south and southeast of Asheville, North Carolina, so central to western part of North Carolina. It was built in 1915, had numerous additions as the textile use developed over time. They last made textiles here in 1967. And from that time until just a few years ago, it sat vacant. The city did wind up taking this on. They took the property over, I think, for back taxes around 2000 as part of trying to get somebody to redevelop this again, large building for the size of this town and where it's placed. This was an important property for the city. So they took control in 2000. They were actually behind listing it on the National Register. So again, the planning department in Hendersonville felt that this was important. They advanced the National Register listing to make it a little bit easier for a developer to come in. And a series of development plans for the next 16 years came forward. People partnered with the city and then dropped out. Our developer, Belmont Sayer, out of the Raleigh-Durham area, we've done quite a few projects on, initially responded to an RFP in 2016. The city, and I think a lot of developers that were coming to them were suggesting it needed to be a hotel because Hendersonville it's a tourist economy for the most part. A lot of people with second homes out around the periphery of downtown, but it's got a cute little main street. And most people thought we'll get a piece of the tourists coming to town. Our developer said, look, the real need from what we can see is not just to activate this set of buildings, but you don't have enough people living downtown. You've got people that come in again and sort of spend money throughout the day as tourists. But if you can get a set of people that live in this area, obviously they're more invested. There's more activity downtown. You're not relying entirely on tourist traffic all of the time. So they saw this building. Quite a bit of work needed to be done to it. Inside, this was not only an eyesore for the town. There were also safety issues, public safety issues, as it sat vacant. People were using this, obviously, for either vandalism of some sort or another, people living here as well that needed to do so. And as you can see, that just presented an issue for the city. As I mentioned, it's downtown. So this is their kind of cute little main street, a lot of retail, a lot of vacant second story above the retail. But for the most part, well-utilized retail shops on the main street. This sat just 2 blocks off of there. The city or county government buildings are here, the courthouse just a block away. And like the Pizitz example, compared to the community, this was a large piece of downtown. Not quite a full block, about a half block, but still the largest scale building downtown Hendersonville. Just a quick plan to show you that started with a 1915 knitting building, expanded in the 20s and the 40s, but it's set up really nicely for a series of units on either side of these wings, kind of an open courtyard in the middle here as well. This project just finished up, in fact, last year. The first residents moved in, apartments throughout here, and it has leased up in a matter of months. So went to show, I think, that the idea that housing would sell here and was a good use for this really did come through. Before and after here of one wing that had all their industrial stash windows replaced in the late 20th century, and those were all restored, as you can see, and this facade and this building activated again. $7.2 million in qualified costs. That's almost $1.5 million tax credits at the federal level, a little over $2 million at the state level for the North Carolina program. And it created 35 apartments. And a portion of those, as you can see, are reserved for particular income brackets. And most importantly, it connected this building again to downtown. So you can see it just linked up the street to the Main Street area there. Another smaller scale example is this is another Main Street community in Florence, South Carolina. This is called the Rainwater Building. It was built in the 20s with changes in the 1950s. It had been vacant like much of downtown Florence. This is a city that really invested in new building in the 1970s and 80s. They have had a downtown area along the street here that really had a lot of vacancy, certainly underutilized. And the city, to their credit, in the 2000s, early 2000s, decided to try to push for revitalization of downtown. They started programming events downtown. They, like Hendersonville, determined that they were going to list a certain portion of their downtown on the National Register. That included this building and quite a few others. They also started to put together different things, incentive packages, working with developers locally to really show that they were invested in helping developers along and get them to a place where they could reactivate these buildings. Before and after here, this is what I would consider a pretty typical Main Street building, retail on the ground level. Historically, it had either offices up above or sometimes apartments or boarding house. This one had offices up above historically, but you can see the main level space really pretty wide open, columns running right down the middle, and that sense was retained. A accounting firm moved into this building, and they do have kind of an open office layout, or they did when the project was put in. So it worked perfectly for this type of space. Upstairs, they retained the historic stairway and kept, again, kind of the open sense of the offices that they had there historically. This was a $2.4 million project. Federal credits. South Carolina has a couple of different tax credits that can be used. And again, an accounting firm moved into this building. Most importantly, though, this building was just one of a series of buildings that a group of local developers took on. And they really committed to this idea of, working with the city, investing in these buildings. Most of them were from the town. Most of them had done work throughout the Southeast, but still lived in Florence and really committed to it. So this was the second They, I think, have done 7 buildings downtown in Florence now. And so it is a real success story, and probably the biggest success story for a city or town of this size in South Carolina. Just to show you, this is that street that we were looking down. As you can see, the city, this is actually City Hall. As I said, they invested in new building in the 70s. So City Hall is this kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of ugly high-rise building built in the 70s. And they have a series of other kind of large-scale museum efforts, and the courthouse is down here as well. So hopefully you've seen through these examples that, you know, there's a use for the historic tax credit programs, we think, in, you know, not only these large-scale projects like the Pizitz building I showed you, where you have a massive building that really should be tying together parts of the city or the town. It's also, you know, great for smaller communities and Main Street communities around the country, and we see it used quite often in those ways. And I think that's why the tax credit programs, you know, nationally, but also in Virginia, as many of you know, have been such a success and have been helpful in keeping many of these communities alive or revitalizing many communities. Maybe it's a good time to take a look and just see, take a peek in the Q&A. How is the remaining 55 million-ish in project costs funded in the Birmingham project? That's a good question. The Pizitz project was a developer, Bayer Properties, who, as I mentioned, is a local Birmingham group. They actually do mostly new construction and strip shopping centers throughout the Southeast. So historic buildings, old buildings was not their thing at all, but they had a decent amount of funding behind them. The Birmingham City Council also added some incentives for the Pizitz, knowing that this was an important piece of things. Together between the city and between some federal bonds, they put together about $7 million or $5 million, sorry, of those types of resources, and some additional funding as well. So it was an effort that required quite a few different things. I will also tell you that of that $66 million came out to, can't remember exactly what the final tax credit number was, but those were syndicated, those historic credits. And so, you know, that probably between the $5 million at the state level and I think it was $15 million in federal credit, you know, that probably brought in another $15 to $20 million in capital for the project. So it was a massive deal, and not the most difficult one always, but it was a pretty successful project, not just for Birmingham, but nationally. It was a pretty well-known example. Another question, what are the restrictions in terms of numbers of years the rehab assets must be in place? As an example, market changes and need to change apartment to office after 10 years in service. So that one of the reasons why in the historic tax credit development field, you all certainly have heard of low-income housing tax credits, you've got energy credits, you've got new market credits out there. In that field or in that area, historic credits are typically a good program because there's a 5-year compliance period after you finish the rehabilitation. So the work that you've done needs to stay in place for 5 years. The ownership needs to stay intact for 5 years. But after that 5 years, you're free to dispose of the property. We don't like to say this, but technically you could tear down the building if you had local approval to do that. So you're tied to compliance for 5 years after the tax credit program is completed. A lot of inquiries about small residential processes or residential properties. I assume they need to get listed first and look into funding options. So do you know of any grant or low interest loan sources for smaller projects? I think, grant programs, it depends a little bit on the state and the locality that you're working on. In fact, all state preservation offices in the country do get funding, really, I won't say a lot, but a primary source of funding for the state historic preservation offices is from the federal government, and a portion of those funds have to be used for grants throughout the state. So the SHPO, the DHR does have a grant program in Virginia. There are a number of local organizations that tend to have incentive and grant programs as well. We also see, particularly for downtowns, many of the other kind of Main Street toolbox tools utilized for historic rehab. Facade grants, transportation corridor grants, that type of thing, often are good incentive, or not incentive, but a good funding source for historic projects on a smaller scale. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about one area that we see, as another planning issue, I guess, for folks around the country, communities around the country, and we see, a lot of projects, affordable housing projects, utilizing historic credits. I mean, there are very few communities around the country that I've seen that don't have some sort of housing problem, housing conundrum, whether it's, not enough quality housing, not enough low income housing. This is an issue that seems like every community in our country is facing, and particularly with affordable housing developers, who are working in neighborhoods and in areas that are difficult to work in. This incentive, when they have the opportunity, makes a lot of sense. And so we do, of the projects we work on around the country, we nearly half of what we work on are affordable housing projects in some way or another. So it is the largest portion of what we work on around the country, and we think that the historic tax credit program is a great tool for housing issues and in communities. So a couple of examples for that. This is the Congress Building, which is in Miami. It is in downtown Miami. Built in the 1920s. It was actually converted from office and retail on the ground level into affordable housing, low-income housing in the 1990s. It's right next to a transit line, so it's well situated for the LIHTC program, low-income housing tax credit program, and for making sure that folks in that building can stay connected to the rest of the community. It was listed in the National Register previously. So this is a not unusual occurrence these days for us. Properties, particularly that were rehabbed in the 90s, using the low-income housing tax credit program and also using the historic, out of their 15-year compliance program or period for the low-income housing tax credit program, they are looking to rehabilitate the building. So they're trying to update finishes throughout the building, systems, building envelope. So they're spending a substantial amount of money in the rehabilitation, and for that reason qualify for the program a second time. Congress Building is located right, as I mentioned, right in downtown. So this is an area that is, dominated by not only office towers, but more and more high-rise condominiums. So, folks that own a property here, a lot of international owners, it's a difficult place to find an affordable piece of property. So this program and the LIHTC program are really helping to drive a rehab of this project and keep it affordable, keep it open to this community of residents. It's estimated at $8 million in qualified rehab costs. As I said, it's also utilizing the low-income housing tax program. And obviously the interest here is in keeping 129 low-income and affordable apartments in downtown Miami, keeping them affordable and on the books for housing. The main level, the street level, is a series of retail shops as well. But it has this, from a historic perspective, has this great terracotta facade to it. Great interiors in the lobby space as well. So I'd love to show you a whole bunch of other photographs of this building, but time doesn't allow exactly. I should mention before I get to our last two examples that I mentioned the National Register program. I want to make sure that everybody kind of soaks in what I mentioned about the 50-year age mark. Typically a project or property needs to be at least 50 years of age to at least be considered for the National Register. 50 years seems like a long time, but those of us that are at or close to 50 recognize that the cutoff date right now, and I need to update the slide for the new year, but a building that was built before 1971 at this point, that's what we're considering for the National Register. So a few examples here for buildings that when you pass by them on the street might not strike you as historic, but are. This is the former RJR Reynolds tobacco facility in Winston-Salem, built in the late 1930s. A lot of glass block, a lot of concrete. This has now been turned into part of it into the Wake Forest Medical School and Biotech Place. This is a building, the Griffin Motor Company building, along a highway in Florence, South Carolina, built in the 1940s. This was a auto showroom, but also was a garage for race cars when stock car racing first started getting big. The Irvin Building in Charlotte, built in the 1960s, housing developers headquarters. And then one some of you might be familiar with, up in Alexandria, we have throughout the country, we have garden apartments that were built between the 1950s and 1970s using federal housing administration loans. And in Alexandria, a listing for the National Register has been put together for garden apartments like this. So Colonial Village is a project we worked on. I'll show you another here in a minute that we're currently working on. But these sort of ubiquitous garden apartments, many of them can be considered for the National Register at this point. That example up in Arlington that we're currently working on with Wesley Housing is Knightsbridge Apartments. I think this is now the third or fourth garden apartment complex in Arlington that we've worked on with them. Built in 1947. As I mentioned, there's a multiple property documentation form for garden apartments in Arlington County, 1934 to 1954, and this building or this series of buildings is part of that listing. because it was developed using the FHA program in 1947. This is about $6.2 million in qualified rehab costs that will keep 37 affordable apartments in play in the area. So again, important use of the historic program for maintaining affordable housing in the area. And then my last example is creating new affordable housing and low-income housing using the program. This is a client that we work with around the country, Commonwealth Development. This is a little bit of an outlier for them in that their typical project with us is similar to what we saw, in our first example, a historic school. They really, look for historic schools in the areas that they're working on, the areas where they're active. This is a little bit different. Historic building in Meridian, Mississippi, a furniture store throughout its lifetime from the 1920s. Currently is still a furniture store on the main level and the ground level, but it is incredibly underutilized. The upper floors are all vacant. Some of them are used as storage these days, but the use for this building, they're using less than 20% of this building right now. That's not great, obviously, for the local tax rolls. We'd love to be able to get full usage in here, make sure that there's more activity in this part of town. Meridian does have revitalization efforts going on throughout its downtown, but this portion of town is slightly outside of where the majority of reinvestment is happening. This is the main floor, their current showroom, so it's an open space, as you can see, with the mezzanine around it. And this is pretty typical of those upper floors, wide open. The top two floors actually were never finished in any way. So you can see unpainted. In fact, the floors, these are all just plank floors. You can see right through them. So there's quite a bit of rehab that will need to be done to make this into housing. But the sponsors of the program or project are keen on it. They have an allocation from the Low-Income Housing Tax program. This is an aerial view that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. This is downtown Meridian that's seeing quite a bit of redevelopment, and this area along Front Street, typically or historically associated with the railroad line. These buildings have more or less been vacant or underutilized for most of the last 3 or 4 decades. So the city is interested in getting folks into that area, and this development group obviously is looking for properties that are adjacent to downtown that still connect their residents to it, but that might be a little bit easier to work with. This is an estimated $7 million project. They're also utilizing state historic credits and LIHTC programs I mentioned, and that'll bring a new 32 units of low income and affordable housing to the downtown. So hopefully that gives you kind of an array of different project types, different uses of the historic program. One thing I'll leave you with is that it really, using these programs and trying to incentivize folks to use these programs and invest in your communities, it requires a lot of confidence and a lot of support from local planners, town and city leaders. The successful examples that I showed, Florence, Gray Mill in Hendersonville, that really was something that the city, in a way, helped initiate. And it's very easy, as you all know, to put up roadblocks to figure out reasons why something can't happen. It's much more difficult, obviously, to support people, show people that this type of program, if it hasn't been used before, can be done. And it really is, a great resource for majority of you all, I think, are government planners or local government planners in some way or another. Knowing these programs are out there, knowing how to connect people to resources to get these done, and supporting folks that are trying to invest in the communities. That can be done in any number of ways. Obviously, local financial help, but I think just as important, we see a lot of times is the support at the building official's office. Being able to look at a historic building and sort of apply variances where they make sense and where they can be done safely, but also working with your zoning department to try to incentivize people rehabbing these buildings, getting a use back into them, and hopefully getting them back on the tax rolls. I think I will stop there. I'll just mention again our firm, MacRostie Historic Advisors. Our website has some great resources on projects that we've worked on the programs just in general. And there's contact information there as well for me, for the other folks that work in our firm. And we'd be happy to obviously talk to you about the programs and about how they might be utilized for your project or for your area. I'm going to take a look at the Q&As here. Let's see. For HTC projects that have several tenants, what vacancy rate is acceptable? Typically to complete the historic tax credit program, you will need to at least white box all of the spaces. So you need to show that you've completed rehab, but you may still have vacancies. You may come to the end of your tax credit project. You may wind up completing the majority of work and still have areas that you need to lease out. It's perfectly acceptable for those to be unrented or unleased at that point. You just need to show that you have completed work to a substantial, to a point where it is completed. So if you started demo and you've taken down finishes and it was historically a finished space, you need to be able to show that that was finished or is finished again. And typically, that term white boxing the space or making sure that it meets that definition, or the Park Service definition for it, is what's needed. So vacancy rate actually isn't something that they're terribly concerned with. They're concerned with showing that the work is completed. I think I got that question right. If not, you can type in a follow-up question, it'd be fine. Is it possible to rehab a historic school building with HRTCs and keep it as a school? Will the governor's school projects in Richmond and Petersburg somehow use those? So this is the point where I tell you I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an accountant. There are ways that people have structured their historic tax credit deals to utilize them, even when they have a use that might not be, on the face of it, income producing. Typically that's done by creating an income producing entity that is then shared, ownership is shared, or managing a piece of it put on that nonprofit use or that school use. So it is possible. It has been done. I'm not the right person to answer that question exactly, but it is. I would say on the face of it, don't assume that any use is kind of out of the question. You should at least explore that with an attorney, and we're more than happy to send you to some of the attorneys we work with quite often in answering those questions. But yes, we have seen it done. Nonprofit uses. There are specific leases that are disqualified in the regulations, but we have seen nonprofits use the credit, again, in a way, in a way, structuring it in a way that it will work within those regulations. Which standards are most problematic in most rehab projects? By standards, we're talking about the standards for rehabilitation. These are the national standards that are used to evaluate your design. What is the most difficult? Well, I would say that there are two things that come up quite often. One is demolition. So the standard in question there relates to historic fabric, historic finishes that you have. Taking out any of those items are typically, very difficult thing to overcome. And so I would say that's one. The other is the one that we spend, I think, the majority of our time on, our standard 9, which deals with trying to make sure that any new construction or changes that you're making to the building are differentiated but historically compatible. So think of this, if we're putting a small addition onto the back of a historic building, you might think that a preservationist or a historian would want you to design that addition so that it matches the historic building. We want to stay away from that usually. We want to be able to recognize, kind of as you're seeing it, that that addition is not historic. We don't want to make somebody think that it is a historic building. So we want it differentiated, but we also don't want you to put a glass cube out there when you've got a kind of temple fronted building. We want something that's compatible. And so this is the piece where, having a great architect, that can make their way through that, can respond to information from our reviewers, really pays off. And so I would say those are the two standards that we find most time spent on, at least in our reviews. Paige, I see that we're over an hour, so I'm happy to sit back if there are not any other questions.
If there are no other questions, well, I think there's one more that just came in, unless you just answered that one.
Oh, right. No, I see that. We usually find ADA compliance and fire code issues tend to make people shy away from historic rehabs. Any thoughts? Yes, those are meeting ADA is a challenge, and with historic buildings, it can be a particular challenge. Second means of egress in buildings that are downtown. Trying to negotiate stairs where you have a prominent staircase at the front of a building and provide the same type of access or same access for ADA does get to be difficult. They're not impossible to overcome, I would say. They are, difficult items to address, but again, a good architect, can do quite a bit within the standards and design-wise to hide some of those things that we need to do from an ADA perspective. I think this is another place where, it's not your building official that necessarily signs off on ADA, but, working with your building official to make sure that you're addressing ADA concerns and, providing access, equal access in a way that can be done within the building. I think, on the face of it, the other thing that we find is that sometimes it's not a design solution to ADA. Sometimes it's a programmatic way that you address ADA, and that can sometimes work within historic buildings as well. But I'm not going to say it's simple. It certainly is does present an additional challenge, and when you're working with the building that that is there in front of you and where you have to retain certain elements, there's a lot of other parameters to historic buildings and projects that that we don't have in new construction. So yes, there are some additional steps along the way, but I think the investment in the building that we have, the fact that these historic buildings usually are located within our existing infrastructure, from a sustainability standpoint, if you're looking at retaining the energy that's embodied in those buildings from when they were built, the fact that they relate usually quite well to the infrastructure, their placement. Keeping these buildings is I think a great asset for our community, and a great way to continue to define ourselves as communities as well. So difficult, but yes, it can be done, and ADA concerns can be addressed.
Okay, that looks to be the last of our questions. So I'll go ahead and just say thank you again to everyone that joined us today. Thank you to Richard for giving this presentation. Like I've said before, all of our webinars are recorded and will be posted to the chapter YouTube page by the end of the day. Please also be on the lookout for a follow-up email with the CM number in case you missed it, and some more information regarding next month's webinar. So I will say good afternoon again, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.